Hey everybody, time for our second lecture on Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. I thought what I would do is just sort of go through the events in the book up through part 2, chapter 4, which is what your reading assignment was up to. Just kind of go over the different events that happened, touch on some highlights and things I think are particularly important. Some issues related to the sort of mental state that Raskolnikov is in, which is obviously not good. His living circumstances, the question of whether or not he has committed his crime in a way that he's likely to be found out, how he responds to hearing about people talk about this murder, right? Because it was right in sort of the neighborhood where he lives. And as we know, the local police are very close. So it's not surprising that people are talking about the murder of the pawnbroker and her sister. And so we'll talk about some of those things. One of the things that I was actually planning to mention in my first lecture that I forgot is that just like in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, there are lots of different references to the color yellow. When we talked about what that might symbolize, illness, evil, etc. The presence of the monster in Frankenstein, right? The moon appearing yellow in the sky, and some other references. There are lots of references also to the color yellow in Crime and Punishment, referring to a whole bunch of different things: the people's skin color, the color of the walls of rooms, especially old paint or old wallpaper that has started to look yellow. Lots of different things in sort of the everyday environment that Raskolnikov finds himself in, referring to the color yellow, some old sugar that he puts in his coffee that has sort of turned yellow. So again, I think in here, obviously, it's illness that is probably would be the overriding sort of symbol for the color yellow in the story. And it seems pervasive in some cases. Within 3 or 4 pages of the book, you'll see the color yellow referred to 5 or 6 different times. So something to look out for and think about a little bit, because I think it's supposed to, again, it sets a tone for the book. It gives us a way of envisioning what the general environment might look like, both in terms of Raskolnikov's garret apartment, his tiny little apartment, in terms of the working class part of St. Petersburg that he lives in, right? The color of the streets and the sidewalk and the buildings, the color of things in the apartment of the pawnbroker, and what that sort of looks like, um, and some of the other environments that he finds himself in. So just sort of be on the lookout for that. I think you'll find that it's pretty pervasive here. So the big thing that happens here as we move into the latter part of part 1, of course, is this letter that Raskolnikov receives from his mother, talking about the impending wedding of Raskolnikov's sister Dunya to this guy, Peter Petrovich Luzhin. I know I talked last time about the letter and the fact that she kind of gives away that he is not the perfect mate for Raskolnikov's sister, that there definitely seem to be some negative qualities that he has. And there we find that the kind of negative qualities that Raskolnikov in particular is going to really be bothered by. The fact that he sees himself as kind of an elitist, the way in which he just seems to want to, he's playing a role in some sense of being this upwardly mobile, already wealthy, or at least he's on his road to being wealthy, um, person who puts on airs a lot, who wants to look impressive and sound impressive. The fact that he doesn't seem to be, that he's kind of an elitist in his own way, that he doesn't really have reason to think a lot of himself the way he's sort of described. He's not necessarily that well educated or from a well-to-do family or anything like that, as he's described. And the fact that he mentioned in talking with the prospects of marrying Dunya, with Dunya and Raskolnikov's mother, that he thinks it would be great to marry somebody who is dependent on him, somebody who's from a lower station in life, somebody who's perhaps living in poverty, that he can make feel making him feel good about himself in the sense that he's helping this person out of their living conditions, but also because they will then be beholden to him, will be dependent on him, and he thinks that would be great to have somebody who he can be sort of a savior for, who is dependent on him, and probably would put up with a lot from him because they're dependent on him, wouldn't leave him maybe even after facing certain abuses from him because they were dependent on him because of their poverty, and that he had the brazenness and maybe the lack of awareness to actually mention this out loud. And this is something that, along with a couple other things about him, that it's interesting that Raskolnikov's mother decides to include in this letter. And in the letter, it seems like she's trying to persuade him to be happy about this, to accept Luzhin when he meets him, that he can perhaps, from Luzhin, become a law clerk and continue his studies, and to feel happy for Dunya about this. But Raskolnikov sees it as her making a sacrifice for him that makes him very angry. He's already angry that he has to accept money from his mother's pension to, pay his rent that he has actually fallen in arrears with, to buy food, other kinds of things that he's really not happy with. And she mentions the fact that he has these character flaws. So you sort of wonder at one level, um, why would she mention these things if she really wants Raskolnikov to accept Luzhin and accept these sacrifices that his sister is making for him? Is it some level that she doesn't want Raskolnikov to accept him? She talks about not judging him right away when he meets him, and be open-minded and all of these things, but then she includes in her letter these negative characteristics. So I think we're kind of wonder why that's the case. Perhaps she knows that Raskolnikov was going to be a harsh judge of Luzhin, like he would be of anybody who wants to be the husband of Dunya. He really clearly loves his sister like his mother and wants what's best for her. And it seems like would only approve as a mate for her sister somebody who he really thinks a lot of. And there are not a lot of people Raskolnikov thinks a lot of. And a lot of this, obviously, is reflected by his illness, the sorry state that he's in. And I know I mentioned in my first lecture to really think about the mental illness that Raskolnikov is dealing with, that is sort of described as monomania. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that he feels bad about himself. He feels helpless, and he hates feeling helpless and needing to accept this money from his mother. His malnutrition, he's not eating much, he's not drinking much, he's in really bad shape, he's lost weight. He doesn't have any money coming into him, and he's just sort of down and out. And that definitely will impact his state of mind. And again, Dostoevsky does a brilliant job of putting us in his head through these different things that he's experiencing. And in part, I think, to help us to be sympathetic with him to a certain extent. Again, we need to at least have some amount of rooting for him and wanting him to do well, right? Even after committing the murders, for the novel to really work, right? If we just totally give up on Raskolnikov from the beginning, I think it takes away a lot from the book in terms of our caring about what happens to him. I think we're supposed to really be rooting for him at some level to do the right thing or try to make up for the mistakes that he makes, etc. But he is dealing with this illness, and it is, I think, made worse by the poverty that he's experiencing and his malnutrition. So everything is sort of hazy in his environment. He's frequently about to pass out when he goes upstairs, or when he finds himself in an emotionally charged situation because of his ill health that he has really been experiencing. So so we know he's really angry after reading this letter. He's not going to accept Luzhin as a brother-in-law, as the love interest for his sister. And I think there's a comparison here that we're to make between Dunya as making a sacrifice for Raskolnikov and Sonia for making a sacrifice for her family. Remember Marmeladov's daughter Sonia, who is prostituting herself and making a sacrifice, and we find out that she really hopes that she'll be forgiven for what she's doing in prostituting herself because she is deeply religious. We know that Raskolnikov is not deeply religious. However, we also know that these ideas from the young generation, these scientific ideas and a scientific morality to replace Christian compassion, is something that is on his mind, is something he's thinking about, is something potentially that could be allowing him to legitimize killing the pawnbroker, right? That he's adding to the aggregate of happiness in the world by getting rid of her because she's making all these people miserable. And that he can do good with the money that he steals from her. And so he's been thinking about these ideas himself. But these ideas have also led to, I think, some of the mental instability that he's dealing with here. And this question about is he one of these elitist people, one of these very few people who can commit a horrible crime or do something really horrible, something unethical for the well-being of other people and get away with it. And this idea that society needs these kinds of people to create history, to make things happen that are meaningful and significant, to create change over time, even if these people, again, are horribly unethical and do horrible things. And so some of the things that he thinks about himself as being special, being super intellectual, can he get away with sort of being a Napoleon, as he puts it, and doing something like killing the pawnbroker? And then, as we find it, having to kill the pawnbroker's sister as well, who seems to be totally innocent, for some kind of a greater good, and his struggles in trying to legitimize what he's doing. So we know that he has this desire at one point to visit his friend Razumikin, maybe to get help from him. He's not necessarily sure why. There's several instances where he seems to crave the company of somebody else, be it Razumikin or maybe it's Nastasia who takes care of him, who works for his landlady, or people in a bar when he feels lonely. But then it seems like he becomes irritable at the same time whenever he's around other people. Because of the things they say, that what they do, that make him think about his sorry state that he's in, and especially that remind him of this crime that he has committed. So he's going to go see Razumikin, and he decides he's going to wait until after he commits the crime, and then he's going to go to see Razumikin. And he has this horrible dream of being with his father, and they're going to his mother's grave. And of course, we know that his mother is actually still alive at this point. And they're on their way there to make this trip. It says he's about 7 years old at the time. And they witness a bunch of drunken peasants coming out of a bar. And they're going to be going somewhere. And there's a cart with this sorry-looking horse, very old horse, who seems barely unable to pull the cart with anything in it, much less the peasant who owns the horse. And then on top of that, he tells all of these drunken people who are singing songs and just kind of having a time that they should get in the cart, and he's going to show that he can make this horse pull this cart with all these people in it. And he can even make him trot. And we know that that's impossible. That's just not going to happen. And the horse really strains to pull the cart with all these people in it. It's really upsetting. Young Raskolnikov, again, at around age 7, he doesn't know why they're being so abusive. He says to his father, why are they doing it? His father says, explains, well, they're just, they're drunk, but that's not our business. That's their own business, and we should ignore it. And the peasant himself keeps saying, it's my horse. I can do what I want to do with it, even if it comes to me abusing it. and everybody's whipping the horse, trying to get it to pull the cart. It can't do it. And eventually he bludgeons it with a crowbar or some kind of a heavy object of some kind or another. And they beat the horse to death. And it's horrible. It's actually something that I, as many times as I've read the book, I still find really troubling, because it is a helpless animal that they're abusing. And of course, we're supposed to think about this dream that Raskolnikov has as representative or symbolic of the murder he's going to commit of the pawnbroker, who really is helpless. And we find out that he's going to murder her with an axe. And I think we're supposed to think, why an axe murder, right? Why do it that way? He mentions that he considered doing it with a knife, but he thinks that it might take stabbing her multiple times to kill her. He feels very weak, but maybe strong enough to lift an axe, and one heavy strike over the head with an axe will take care of her. And before she can say anything or scream out, make any kind of noise, that people would come running. So he decides to use an axe. But clearly he's troubled by this. His conscience at some level is troubled by it. And that this is what the dream is about, right? The horse represents the pawnbroker, and the way he's going to commit this real brutal murder of a helpless victim, and for maybe not a real significant purpose. He tries to justify killing her, that he's going to steal from her, and he's going to have money then that he will therefore be able to give to his sister and his mother, so that Doni doesn't have to marry Luzhin. But you get the sense that that's not maybe his main, or certainly his only motive for what he's doing. Certainly not a significant enough motive to commit this murder. So at some level, his conscience is really, pricking him at the same time that he's trying to justify it for himself. And then he ends up overhearing in the Haymarket Lizaveta, who's the half-sister of Alanya, that she is going to be coming back to the Haymarket the next day at 7 o'clock to try and help some people who are new to St. Petersburg sell some clothing, because they need money. They're desperately poor. And he overhears this. And just like Victor in Frankenstein has these events happen to him that makes him think that what he's going to do is fate, the same thing happens here with Raskolnikov. Even though he tells himself he's only playing in his mind with killing the pawnbroker, it seems fate to him. It seems like his destiny that he's going to murder her, because he has found out serendipitously that that Elizabeth is going to be in the Haymarket at 7 o'clock. So he knows that she's not going to be there or walk in on Raskolnikov killing the pawnbroker. Now, of course, what he doesn't think about very carefully is the fact that there might be other people coming by the apartment coming to pawn things, because she is a pawnbroker and certainly would have visitors at all hours and at all times who want to pawn things, people who are in desperate states financially. And I think we find out throughout this part of the book that, while on the one hand, Raskolnikov has thought through things very carefully about committing this murder. He knows he wants to use the axe. He knows where the axe is located, right, in the first floor of the apartment. He knows that he can get the axe, that the door to the kitchen is left open all the time, that he has this fabric that he's going to sew a little piece of fabric into his heavy overcoat that he can hang the axe in. And so his greatcoat, as they call them, he will be wearing. The axe will be hanging inside it underneath one of the sleeves, that nobody will be able to see the axe, and that when he puts his hand in the pocket on that side of his coat, he can actually hold the end of the axe so it's not really swinging violently under the coat and being noticeable, because there's a hole in the pocket that his hand can reach all the way through. So it seems like he's thought about these things, but there's some things he really hasn't thought about carefully. For example, about other people coming by to pawn things while he's in the apartment, and about what he's going to do with what he steals. from the pawnbroker? What happens if he can't find her money? What happens if he just finds items that people have given to her to pawn? What is he going to do with them? How is he going to sell them? Who is he going to sell them to get money? Maybe for himself and for his sister and for his mother. Because he tells himself that he is this brilliant individual who can commit the perfect crime that nobody can find out because he won't make any mistakes. It'll be the perfect crime. And as we find out, he really bungles things in multiple ways when he actually does commit this crime. But he takes this hearing, that Lizaveta is going to be not, he's going to be in the Haymarket at the time he's going to commit the crime. He also has some other things happen, I think, that are important here. He runs across this poor girl who looks like she's been taken advantage of, and a man who looks like either he was the one that took advantage of her or he wants to take further advantage of her. It looks like she's maybe been drinking. Her clothes are in tatters, and he tries to keep this man away from her. Eventually, there's a policeman who comes on the scene. He explains what's going on. The policeman agrees with him that this man is going to take advantage of her. He gives the policeman money and says, get her somebody to take her back to her apartment or back to where her mother lives or her family, so she's not taken advantage of. And then again, as soon as he does this, he feels like he was stupid for doing it. And he starts thinking in terms of this new modern morality, right? The new morality tells us that a certain number of people we have to be sacrificed for the greater good. And maybe she's one of these people. She's already down and out. She's been drinking. She looks like she has nothing to do with her life. And so maybe she has to be sacrificed for the greater good. So his mind is switching back and forth constantly from having an almost kind of Christian compassion, or at least a conscience that's going to lead him to do the right things, just like he left the money for Marmeladov and his family. And on the other hand, telling himself that he needs the money himself. Why is he giving it up? That, again, according to this new morality, some people are going to have to be sacrificed for the greater good. And so he can legitimize what he's doing. And this is something that I think is explaining why he has a change of heart or a change of mind all the time in the things that he's doing. We also know that he came across some young people, students, in a bar playing pool, and he overheard them talking about whether or not it would be legitimate, whether it would be ethical to kill somebody who is making everybody else miserable for the greater good. And not only are they talking about the general topic, they're talking about it in terms of the pawnbroker, because they know the pawnbroker. It sounds like other students have had to take things there to pawn from her. And the student says, would it be ethical, following this new scientific morality, to kill her because she makes everybody miserable? She's an old hag. She's mean to her sister, Lizaveta, who takes care of her, that she has already signed in her will that everything in her will, except for her furniture and things which will go to her sister or half sister, that all of her money will go to keep up her gravesite, and for the church, and to pay for for people to pray for her, and therefore maybe ensure that she will go to heaven instead of hell, and that her soul will be taken care of, after her death, and that she's not going to give any of it to her sister, who has done all this to take care of her. She cleans the apartment. She goes to the Haymarket and does business for her half sister, does all these nice things, and is just abused all the time. And that would be a legitimate reason for murdering the pawnbroker. Of course, on the other hand, that at the same time that Raskolnikov and these other students are trying to legitimate killing the pawnbroker because she's mean and nasty and everything else, she does perform a service that lots of people need, clearly. And of course, everybody wants to get more for the items that they pawn than the pawnbroker is going to be willing to give them. That's the way things go, right? I mean, if she's going to eventually get money from them herself after the allotted time is up for them to pay to get the things out of being pawned, um, that she's going to not give as much money for them as people would like to get from them. But she's always there. She's a service. Seems like a professional in what she does. So it also seems like they're trying to focus on her negative character traits to help her be, legitimate this idea of doing away with her, or for Raskolnikov himself to actually try and murder her, which we know that he eventually does. So we end up at the actual murder scene. And here is an artist's rendering of the murder scene. So he goes to murder her, and the first problem he has is that he ended up sleeping late and gets a late start, which means that even though he knows he still has some time, because he knows when Lizaveta is going to be in the Haymarket, that he's running late. And he hadn't, before he fell asleep, and he does fall asleep all the time because, again, he's ill, he's malnourished, and he doesn't have anybody to wake him up, even though Nastasha sometimes will wake him up. He's not taking the time to make sure that he has all his preparations in order, right? Which includes sewing this piece of fabric in his coat. And he has to do that at the last minute. And that he goes to get the axe and it's not there. That he had, doesn't have access to it to get in there when he thinks he's going to. And of course, Nastasha's in the building. And so he says, okay, I guess I'm not going to do this. And maybe it wasn't fated for me to do it. And then he realizes that one of the people that works in the building and takes care of the building is not there a lot of the time, and finds out that in the place where he works out of, that there's an axe there, and it's there that he's not there, and that he can take the axe, and he does. So he's sort of back on the path again to committing the murder. He knows how many steps it's going to be. He goes to her apartment. We know that there are painters in the apartment and other people there. It seems like it's pretty busy with people coming and going, which make things pretty precarious for him. He climbs the stairs to her apartment and knocks on the door. And it seems like she's there. You can hear her on the other side of the door, but she won't open the door. And one of the things that seems kind of interesting in the way it's described, which doesn't seem to actually match this picture very well. And clearly the picture is Lizaveta coming into the apartment after Raskolnikov has killed Alanya and not finished yet with getting the loot and cleaning off the axe and everything else, is that it sounds like the door opens out to the apartment, not in. But there's a kind of a chain on the door that if somebody's in the apartment, they can make sure that nobody can get inside. Now in this picture, it looks like the door opens into the apartment, but the way it's described, it sounds like it opens out. And so Alanya opens the door, but the chain is still on the door, and he yanks on the door. And so the chain is there, so he can't pull it all the way open. Eventually, he gets her to get the chain off the door and violently pulls the door open. And as it's described, it almost pulls her out of the apartment because, again, it sounds like the door opens out. She remembers who he is finally, and he says, "Don't you remember me? I came to pawn something the other day, and I told you I'd be back with a silver cigarette case," or something like that. And we know he has something he's made up to be like a silver cigarette case, but it's just a piece of wood with a piece of metal next to it to make it heavy. And then he's wrapped it up very carefully, so it's going to take her a long time to unwrap, which gives him plenty of time to bonk her over the head with his axe. And he's very nervous. He wants to tell himself that psychologically he can get away with doing this. He can keep his mind and not make any mistakes in what he's doing. But clearly that's not happening. Clearly and again, some of it is that fact that, psychologically he's committing a murder here, which is not from a psychological standpoint an easy thing to do. And again, he's struggling psychologically on top of that, just as it is, with his poverty, and he hasn't been eating and getting enough food and everything else. So there are lots of reasons for the fact that he's really just fumbling around once he gets in the apartment. He eventually does hit her over the head with the axe, and I think he does it several times to try to make sure that she's actually dead. And there's blood everywhere. And he goes in to try and find out where her money is. And he grabs her key off a chain around her neck. And he's not able to find any money. And he's fumbling around, and finally he decides to look under the bed, and he finds in some clothing that's in this kind of like a trunk that's under the bed, that's where she hides the things that people have pawned in and amongst the clothing. And he sort of pulls stuff out and puts it in something so he can take it away. And then he ends up hearing somebody in the apartment. And he finally realizes that he left the door open while he's committing this murder, which is a pretty big thing to forget. And that suggests the fact that he's fumbling and not doing things with the careful planning that he told himself he was going to do things. And he's not committing the perfect murder here, very clearly. And so she's gotten into the apartment pretty much without him hearing it. And she sees him. She's about to scream, but in such a state of horror and seeing her sister lying on the floor in this puddle of blood that she can't. And so he has to hit her over the head with the axe as well. Now, even though using his scientific ethics, his kind of what seemed like a utilitarian ethics, might be able to justify murdering the pawnbroker and robbing from her because she's a horrible person, he can't do that with Lizaveta, right? She's not a horrible person, right? She's kind of simple-minded. She works really hard. She's very helpful. It's described when she's in the Haymarket with this new family to St. Petersburg that she's trying to help them to get some money for their clothes so they can buy food and get a place to stay. And she's described as a good Christian person. This is the almost the bad side, the downside of what he heard when he heard these students talking about the pawnbroker, because he also heard about what a nice person her sister is, Lizaveta. So what justification can he have for murdering her? Absolutely none, at least any practical justification. Just the fact that she walked in on him and he forgot to close the door, and he could have closed it and put a chain on it and at least for a time kept Lizaveta out of the apartment. But he has to murder her. And even though it sounds like he hits the pawnbroker from behind with the axe so she can't see it coming, he does it right in Lizaveta's face. And it just sounds absolutely horrible. And then, of course, there's blood everywhere. He realizes he has to wash the blood off the axe, and he does so. He realizes there might be some blood on his clothing. He looks and he can't find anything. But he finds that he does have some blood on that he has to wipe off. So he's trying to get all the blood off himself, and he thinks that he's done an adequate job of doing so. Later we find out he hasn't. And he's about to leave the apartment, and some people have come to pawn something. And they knock on the door, and the pawnbroker is not there. And he had put the chain on the door so they can't get in. They think, okay, maybe she's not there. But then one of them, who's, I guess, studying law, says, there's something funny about this. It sounds like the chain is on the door. Well, somebody must be in there if the chain is on the door. So he runs. He tells his friend to stay there because we know that somebody's still in there. Maybe something happened to her. And he's going to go run for help. While he runs for help, the other guy is supposed to stay there. I think Koch is the name of one of them. And he gets tired of waiting, so he leaves. Well, this gives Raskolnikov a chance to get out of the apartment. He gets out of the apartment. He starts running down the stairs. He hears somebody coming up the stairs. He dashes into the room where the painters were working because nobody's in there, and there's a door unlocked and a door open. So he runs down the stairs into an apartment, hides behind the door until the people pass on the way up the stairs going up to Alani's apartment. And then he runs out He has a temptation once he gets out of the building to just run, but he realizes that he'll look, once they find out, as they will any second, what has happened in the apartment, that he will look very suspicious running down the street. So he tells himself he has to be calm, and again, he's counted how many steps it is back to his apartment. He finally makes it back to his apartment, basically just passes out on his couch, in the kind of sorry state that he's in. And again, he's not careful about what he's going to do with everything when he gets back into his apartment. This is an artist rendering of his apartment. Looks like it's maybe a woodcut from a woodcut. He leaves the door open. He just passes out on the couch. He's not careful where he has put things. He did get the axe put back, which is good. And but he has not been careful of what he has done. Eventually, he does wake up, and Nasasa comes to see him and wants to give him some food. And again, he's in really bad shape here, and sort of falls asleep. And then he's woken up again by Anastasia, who's there with somebody with a message. And this message is that he needs to appear before the police. And at first he realizes, oh my gosh, did they find out already that I'm the murderer? Or do they have a suspicion that I'm the murderer? And is it all over already? And you'll notice it several times in the story before he ends up being found out, that he wants to turn himself in because he's just not doing well psychologically with what he did. He thought he was one of these Superman people that could get away with anything, and he can't. His conscience is just killing him. He's a mess psychologically. So at a number of points, he tells himself, okay, just turn yourself in, but he doesn't do it. And he even tells himself he got this summons to appear before the police, and he realizes, okay, I'm going to do this now, get it over with. And on the way there, he says, I might as well turn myself in. I'm a mess. And he gets there and he sits down, and Dostoevsky describes all of these different people at the police office, interesting people there, a woman there who apparently has parties at her apartment that get out of control. And Raskolnikov does act kind of impudent at points because, again, he does have this kind of superiority complex, especially once he finds out that what he was called there for was this IOU he signed for his landlady, and that she, we find out that there's a guy that she's been hanging out with who wants her to actually cash in on the IOU and get the money from Raskolnikov. And so that's why he has been called to the police. Once he realizes that it's not the murderer, he starts acting really impotent with the police, and because he knows that it's no big deal. He just explains what happened, and that he signed this IOU and etc. And he feels kind of relieved by that. They do sort of make fun of him, and one of them talks about these horrible students who are not paying their rent and are just they need to find practical work and really contribute to society and everything else, and that they're committing crimes because they're living in poverty. And so he eventually leaves, goes back to his apartment, and falls asleep again. And then Razumikin appears, his friend Razumikin, who we will see consistently throughout the rest of the book at this point. And he is there, and he is there with one of the people from the police office who he has sort of befriended, and we find out that Razumikin has been to see the police. One of them, it sounds like, is actually a relative of his. And again, everybody's been talking about this murder that has been committed and who might have committed it. And it seems like Raskolnikov has been sleeping for a long time because Razumikin has been by several times to see him. He's actually had the doctor, Zossimov, by to see him, and he's delirious all the time. And he keeps worrying that he's giving away things in the state of delirium that he's in. And it sounds like that that in his state of delirium, when Razumikin had been there with this guy from the police station, that he's been saying things in his sleep, right? When he's been in this, and when in his delirium, about his socks and about things that seem like they have to do with the pawnbroker. We know that when he was at the police office, um, his initial time, the first time he was there, that he passed out when he heard people mentioning the murder of this pawnbroker, and that he looks really guilty because of that, right? Because they passed out. Now, again, he looked sickly and he was obviously not in a good state of mind, and that could be a perfect reason for him to have passed out. He does talk about the fact that he was out at around 7 o'clock and he was just walking around basically nowhere, so he doesn't have an alibi for what happened if he does become a suspect. And now he finds out he was saying stuff in the state of delirium, and the police and Razumikin were there, and he's feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm in a disaster here. Everybody does end up leaving, and he does realize that he did realize that there was blood all over the cuffs of his pants, that where his toe comes through his boot, that the front of the toe of the sock is all bloody, and he has to cut that out. And he has all these kind of things, along with the stuff that he stole from the pawnbroker that he hasn't really been careful yet to hide. We know that he stuffs things in a hole under the wallpaper in his room. He takes the things that he stole and he wants to throw them in the Neva or in the canal, and he can't do that because there are people standing there watching, and he will look guilty throwing stuff in the canal. So he eventually puts it under a rock somewhere behind a fence. He hasn't even looked to see what's in the purse, right? So him telling himself, I committed this murder for the greater good, and I'm going to use this stuff, that either the money or the things that he stole that had been pawned, for the greater good, and give it to his sister or his mother or something, and that he's gotten rid of this horrible pawnbroker. Well, first of all, he has no, he cannot use that reason, or the reason of getting rid of a horrible person because of Lizaveta and having to murder her. So that takes away that legitimation. And he hasn't even looked to see what's in the purse. So this idea that he did it so that he could get money for the things that he took that had been pawned, that goes out the window. So this whole idea of him having legitimate reasons for having murdered the pawnbroker is starting to not really look very good. Which might be why his conscience keeps being very difficult on him, and making him feel really guilty for what he did. There's sort of three reasons that he plays around with, I think are important for why he might have committed the murders that he sort of thinks about. And one of them is that first of all, he's getting rid of a horrible person. And I think one of the students had described her as sort of a louse, right? So she's not any better than a louse, right? And she's not really adding anything to society. Another legitimation is that he can get some money to help his sister and his mother, especially he feels guilty for having stolen from her. And the other is from a sense of agency, and it's almost like the nihilist kind of idea that he's been playing with, about just seeing if he had the guts to do it, if he could go against the ethics of his society, the morals of his society, and throw Christian compassion out the window, and just psychologically get away with committing a meaningless murder. And all three of those reasons seem to be falling apart. He had to kill the pawnbroker's sister. He hasn't done anything practical with what was in what he stole. Psychologically, it seems to be pretty clear that he cannot get away with what he did. That psychologically he's being tortured by it, even as he would like to tell himself that he's strong enough mentally to get away with it. Razumikin had gone with the money that his mother had somebody bring by, and he actually had signed for it for him because, again, Raskolnikov feels really bad taking things from his mother, but she sent by more money. Razumikin uses it to go buy some new clothes for him, thinking that'll make him feel better. And I think we're supposed to wonder why Razumikin is so nice to him. Raskolnikov is still nasty to Razumikin. He hadn't seen him for months until recently. Why is Razumikin taking such good care of him? And as I think I mentioned in my first lecture, I think we're really supposed to see him from the very beginning as being just a really good guy, right? And he tries to find work for Raskolnikov and find out he's translating some books that are in German, and because he's getting some money for doing this, he says, I've got more work that I have to do. He tries to give Raskolnikov some work doing these translations, and he rejects that idea. The translations, again, have to do with all of this new science that is being promulgated. I think the one pamphlet he was translating is a woman, a human being, or something like that, something ridiculous like that. And there are supposed to be these scientific ways about looking at these questions, and the whole thing seems kind of stupid, but nonetheless, it's a way of making money. So Razumikin's doing all this great stuff, and Raskolnikov still seems to be sort of nasty to him. At the very end, they start talking again about the pawnbroker's murder, and in front of Raskolnikov with all these other people in the room. And he can't help himself, but he keeps reacting to things he's hearing them say, which looks really suspicious. He's ignoring everything, and as soon as they mention anything about the murder of the pawnbroker, he seems to perk up and take notice and blurt something out. And this is part of him, I think, knows that this is not looking good. And certainly to the reader, it doesn't look good. He looks really suspicious. And then we find out that Razumikin has figured out exactly how the murder took place, because one of the painters who is feeling this excessive sense of guilt has confessed to committing the murders, and we know he didn't because we know Raskolnikov did. This painter, Nikolai, is supposed to be the opposite of a Napoleonic kind of character like Raskolnikov wants to be, who is one of these few people who is born a genius, a mover and a shaker, and who can ethically get away with doing horrible things because he is one of these people that's going to move society forward or be kind of a change agent in society, do important things, etc. This Nikolai is the opposite. He feels guilt for actually not having done anything horrible as far as we know. He confesses to the crime because he's deeply religious. He seems like he really needs to go to a confession. But he has, like everybody, he's sinned in his life, and he feels bad for these sins he's committed, maybe that he hasn't confessed to. So he confesses to committing this murder that we know he hasn't done. And Razumikin knows that this is ridiculous, because he knows that supposedly at the time that the murder was being committed, this painter and his friend were actually, they were sort of having fun. They had splatted paint on each other, and they had run out of the apartment building, and they were sort of out front of the apartment building, wrestling with each other and sort of acting like they were having a fight, but it was just all in fun. And Razumikin says, how in the world could somebody have just committed the murders be acting like that? There's no way that Nikolai the painter committed the murders. But he also knows, he finds out about this, the jewelry. Nikolai had actually found an earring that Raskolnikov had dropped when he was hiding behind the door of the one apartment. And Nikolai had found it and wanted to get some money for it. And that's why he at first looks like he might be a suspect, right? And then he eventually confesses to having committed a murder he didn't confess. But Razumikin knows exactly what happened. He said whoever committed the murders had the chain on the door and would have been trapped in the apartment. But these two students coming to pawn something, they were going to leave a sentinel in front of the building, and they didn't. And so the person got out of the apartment, tried to leave, but heard the people coming up the stairs, went ducked in the apartment, down a few floors behind the door, must have dropped an earring at that point. People came all the way up the stairs, and whoever committed the murder left that way. Razumikin knows exactly what happened. He knows that Nikolai is not guilty, and eventually, even though he had confessed, he will know that he will be found not guilty for committing the crime, because there's no way he could have. And he knows exactly how it was committed. He just doesn't know it was Raskolnikov who was the one that did it. So things aren't going well for Raskolnikov at this point, right? And at the beginning of the next section of our reading, Luzhin, the fiance of Dunya, is going to show up and have his initial meeting with Raskolnikov. We know it's not going to go well because we know Raskolnikov already hates this guy, even though he hasn't met him. And he's not in a very good state. He seems to be a little more healthy. He seems like he's been eating a little more and having, getting more food. Razumikin's taking care of him. Nastasia's taking care of him. So he's doing better, but he does still seem to be fixated on this murder. And that obviously is making him look pretty guilty. Again, he passed out at the police office. He doesn't have an alibi for where he was at 7 o'clock. So we'll see what will happen to him. We're going to see a lot more soon of his sister and his mother, of Sonia Marmeladov, and her family, who Raskolnikov left some money with. And again, Razumikin is going to be there pretty much all the time too, and will really show himself to be a great friend to Raskolnikov. And maybe he's supposed to appear. Dostoevsky wants to show what a great person he is, because he doesn't even seem to. Again, he hasn't seen Raskolnikov in months, and Raskolnikov mistreats him all the time, but he still is very kind and helpful to him. So that's where we are with the book. So happy reading, and I will be back with another lecture down the road here a little bit. As always, if you have questions about anything from the reading of the class, just let me know, send me an email. If you want to do some kind of a meeting, we can always do that as well. So I will see you later.